and I'm going to ask him to expand on a couple of things, and then it'll be open to you for your questions. So, as I said at the outset, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. The book is set up, and I think you learned from Chris's talk that the book is set up into really essentially two parts: identifying the problems and then identifying solutions. So I want to ask a couple of questions to drill down on the problems, and then a couple of questions to drill down on a couple of the solutions. The one statistic that really hit me at the outset was in the 1950s, CBC TV held 49% of Canada's television audience. And now, okay, guess what it is? It was 49% in the 50s. You know what it is now? 7. So, is there a problem? You need to go no further than that to identify the problem. Now, you mentioned some of the problems. The one thing that I want to ask you about, and it was a phrase that fascinated me, is tell me about the attention economy. What do you mean by the attention economy, and how is that one of the problems that CBC needs to address?
The two kind of go together in that I think the audience might even be smaller than 6% now, but really 6 or 7%. But of course, obviously, the 1950s, when I was growing up, I was very young, I was in Toronto in those days, we had 1 or 2 TV stations in Canada, CBC and CTV, and we could get 3 Buffalo stations, CBS, NBC, and ABC.
It would skip across the lake from Buffalo on a good day.
That's right, and that was everything. And of course now there's a huge range of things you can watch. That began in the 1980s with cable television when it arrived, and all of a sudden people all across Canada could get many more American channels than they could get. There were more Canadian channels as well as Global came along, and CTV, and then there were also, there's TVO and a couple of other provincial educational channels. And now there's even more because there's multilingual channels as well. So there's many more different channels you could actually watch. I think an interesting comparison might be with CBC Radio, where CBC Radio, broadcasting in an environment again where there's multiple different options that people can listen to, initially just over the air, but now if you want to listen to it on the internet, you can do that too by streaming. It still gets an audience of about, it's in most communities, I think I'm right on this, it's the number 1 station, and it's getting an audience that's about 15% of the overall market, which is not a bad number when you think about all the different private broadcasters doing all the different things they're doing. So the attention economy and the lack of attention economy, one or the other, is partly the function of all the different things you can choose to watch on our board, but it's also things that you can choose to do that you couldn't choose to do before, which is video games, which take up a lot of time, even for my son. He spends more time than he should be doing playing video games. And of course social media and everything you can do on social media. And you now see people who will watch television while at the same time they're commenting to their friends on what they're seeing through social media channels. And so there's more and more places where people can pay attention and spend their time, and it's harder and harder to persuade them to spend it on. And we've seen it in traditional television broadcasting too. In the U.S., the audiences for what used to be, or still are, I guess, the supper hour newscasts, the 6:30 newscasts on CBS, NBC, and ABC, they're down quite dramatically, but they still draw more than the top-rated program on CNN, like it's sort of 2 to 1 because I think Tucker Carlson's about 3 million viewers, and the newscasts in the United States, the supper hour newscasts still draw sort of 5 to 8 million a year. So there's many more, it's tougher competition, which in part we argue means you need to be more focused on what you're doing. And you need to develop something distinctive so that and I mentioned earlier about radio being a little bit distinctive for when you hear it, when you're listening to it. Well, I think television, CBC television, if it's going to survive, it needs to be somewhat distinctive as well. Right. But to our mind, that means focusing on a narrower range of things. And concurrent with focusing on a narrow range of things means doing it better, doing the things you do better than anybody else does, so people will feel they have to, if they want to know something, they'll have to tune into you to find out what it is.
Yeah, and 2 other things I want to hit on. One is political interference. We're still talking about identifying the problems. One is political interference, And the second one is just poor management in the CBC itself. So political interference is interesting because the CBC was initially created by R.B. Bennett with the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Corporation in the middle of the Depression to do all of the things that the Friends of the CBC and the CBC's mandate say it should be doing. So interesting that it was created originally by a conservative government, and then Mackenzie King turned it into the CBC, a liberal government. So the CBC is a child of the government, but the government has been interfering with it in negative ways. So perhaps you could elucidate a little bit. What do you mean by political interference as one of the problems, and how could it possibly end? How can we get them to stop interfering?
It's difficult. Interference is a little bit difficult to describe, and that it happens on a couple of different levels. Not that I'm aware of, is there anybody actually from the Prime Minister's office phoning the CBC and saying you should do this or you should do that. I was the executive producer and I was the decision desk for CBC Television on Quebec referendum night, which is probably one of the most consequential nights in Canada and in our 100 and how many years? A little over 125. I remember we did a broadcast in the Windsor Hotel, which used to be a hotel in Montreal right on Dominion Square downtown. And it was a ballroom, so we set up our studio there, we did it there. And I remember sitting outside with Mark Bulgich, who was the program, who was the producer with me, and we were it was snowing a little bit, and we were kind of scared. We were mostly scared that our bosses never told us anything about what we should do. But the message that we got was, don't screw it up, whatever you do. So don't say it's going to be yes when it's going to be no. Don't do anything until you're absolutely sure. But there was no sense that we weren't being told or they were being told about. So that doesn't happen, but I think what does happen, and has happened with increasing frequency, is that the CBC management is spending too much time trying to guess what its political masters actually would like to have happen. And so it may be too often trying to do things that it thinks it's going to make its political masters happy about. But the problem is that political masters aren't going to be happy because they're never happy. So you'd be best not doing that. So we got in trouble once when I was producing the National because we did a story, Neil MacDonald did a story about a guy in Toronto named Mendelssohn Joe, who some people may know who Mendelssohn Joe is, who is a musician originally from McKenna Mendelssohn Mainline, but then became an artist, and he painted a very unflattering picture of Brian Mulroney. And I won't say what the picture featured, but you can look it up. And we put it on the air, and we got in a lot of trouble for that. But that was the only time we ever had any political interference.
But what is interesting, I read
but what the management of CBC is increasingly worried that what they do will lead to their budgets being cut, and so they second guess themselves based on what they think will make the government of the day happy. And I'll tell one little story out of school that maybe I shouldn't, but I will. In 2019, there was the 2019 election. I had stopped, been at Carleton since 2001, but the last few elections, I went back and was Peter Mansbridge's producer for election night. So I was in his ear all evening because I used to do the decision desk stuff, and in his ear on what was going on and what should happen. One of the things you do when you're doing a television election night program is the day before you have what we call the benchmarks meeting, which was a meeting to discuss what all the various scenarios could be and how we describe them. So we don't have one journalist saying it's a landslide win for the Liberal Party and the other person saying, well, it's kind of a tight race. So you want to make sure everybody's singing from the same book. And so there was a discussion about what happens if the Conservatives on election night end up, this is 2019 now, it could have been true in 2021 as well, it wasn't, but if on election night the Conservatives end up with more seats than the Liberals, but not many more, what do you call it on television? Do you call it a Conservative government? Because, of course, it may not be a Conservative government because the Prime Minister, the government of the day, has an opportunity to meet the Governor General and see if he or she can form a majority in the House that would actually allow him or her to run the House. So it could be that the Conservatives could have the most number of seats on election night, but Mr. Trudeau, if he was only, in this case with Mr. Trudeau, if he was only 3 or 4 seats behind, he might decide, well, I'm going to see if I can do a deal with the NDP, something that's come along a little more recently, and I'm going to try and stay in power. And he could conceivably do that. So there was a big debate about what would happen if we don't call it a Conservative government and the Conservatives win, will they cut our budgets? And you should never be having that sort of debate in when you're doing news and when you're doing journalism, because that just gets you then to the point where you're second guessing yourself and you're no longer serving your audience. So in a situation like that, I mean, you could say the Conservatives have the most number of seats. Has to be the end. So, but I think although there's not, I was never party to what I would see as direct political interference. But what we talk about in the book, of course, is we talk about both Jean Chrétien's aversion to Radio-Canada because he thought it was full of separatists, and Mr. Harper's aversion to the CBC to the point where he refused to do a debate in the 2015 election if it was going to be on the CBC, and refused to answer questions from CBC people, even though it was like his government that owned the CBC. But so there's that on that level too.
Yeah, that was the one thing that, among the many things that I read in the book, made me pause, was that too often I use the stereotype in my own mind that the Conservatives are against the CBC and the Liberals are for it. But with respect to Mr. Chrétien, not so much.
I think that the most significant budget cuts the CBC had came under Mr. Chrétien.
Yes. After
the 1996 budget, when Paul Martin decided they were going to balance the budget.
Yeah.
CBC paid a big price on that.
Right. Now, the other thing I think is interesting, and I respect you for it, is that CBC is more than just a victim. And that is one of the problems, still identifying the problems, and the last one before we move on, is CBC has also done it to itself through poor management. So maybe you could expand on that idea.
I think in part, most people would tell you there's too much management. I think a lot of people inside, and without being, I guess the easiest way to describe it, and if there are people who work for government, I'm sorry, it feels a lot like the corporation is another government department now, and that there's too many levels of management, there's too many people at too many levels who aren't directly involved in putting programming on the air, and that distorts a lot of things, slows down decision making in some cases, ties up a lot of money that could be more effectively used by putting people in the field to actually do the reporting, particularly, as I said, when it's cheaper and easier to do the reporting now than it's ever been before. But there were also periods where the public broadcaster kept changing on what it wanted to do. It had a period, I was actually producer, this audience may actually remember that, but some audiences wouldn't. I was actually program producer when we did something really dumb called Primetime News, which was in 1992, where senior management, maybe at the very top, decided that we should move the national newscast from 10 o'clock to 9 o'clock at night because people were going to bed earlier. But there's really no evidence to substantiate any of that than anything I saw. But nonetheless, we did. We killed the National. It was also an attempt to kill the Journal, too, for people who remember the Journal as the last 40 minutes of what used to be the National Journal Hour. So we produced Primetime News for about a year, which was a disaster because it was, we never knew on any given night how much time we had for the news part of the program. So some nights we were doing stories about cats up trees and things like that. But we had like 37 minutes to fill. We didn't have enough good stuff to do it. So that was one experiment that was a disaster. And then the National came back after about a year. It was then redone again 3 or 4 years ago with multiple hosts, which created another set of problems. But they at one point decided to get rid of consolidate supper hour newscasts in Canada Now, which was going to go across the country. Then they broke them up. They had News World that initially, when it opened up, had bureaus in Halifax, Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary. Then they consolidated them all and they moved them around. CBC local television news has always been a very poor second and even third in some markets compared to the private broadcasters. And they've gone back and forth on all that about should they have local news, shouldn't they have local news. So and then was there going to be a nighttime newscast? Wasn't there going to be a nighttime newscast? Then you have the debate in the old days about when the Stanley Cup playoffs are on, should the national be on, shouldn't it be on? So there's all these different issues that in part are driven by advertising, and in part are driven by, I'm not quite sure what, but they all tended to confuse the audience or leave the audience uncertain about what was going to be happening. And the one that caused a lot of consternation most recently was the one surrounding getting rid of local newscasts for the national wrap-up for COVID-19, in which a lot of people were relying on the local news to get a sense of, if you're in Halifax, well, what's going on in Halifax? If people are being asked to, in varying degrees, be their own doctor and make their own decisions about risk management, you've got to give them the tools to do that, and the public broadcaster wasn't. So that hurt them a lot, but it's those kind of decisions.
Yeah, excellent. I want to move on to identifying the solutions, and the one I want to ask you about is exceptional journalism, how to do that, how to have exceptional journalism rather than going for clicks. I want to talk about chart beat. Before we do that, something that I thought, a metaphor that you used for bringing a solution to some of these problems and creating a future for the CBC, is you equated what needs to be done to the CBC to the only podium program for the Olympics. So maybe you could talk about how would the own the podium, you know about the own the podium decision that was made, maybe you could talk about that, and how would that work to help the CBC?
Okay, Own a Podium was a program designed by the government in 2006. It was designed to actually, in 2006 we knew that Canada was going to host the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. We had a fairly, not infamous isn't the quite word, we had a curious reputation of having hosted 2 Olympics previously, in 1976 in Montreal in the summer, and 1988 in Calgary. And I think we were the only country that's ever hosted Olympics that had never won a gold medal at the Olympics that they hosted. So they decided that maybe that would be a good time to change that. So they put a lot of money into more money for athletes, into more money for research, for training, for facilities, for all those sorts of things, and decided that they actually wanted to do much better. And in fact, it's turned out to work quite well in that regard. There are a bunch of other issues that we've seen more recently that are problematic in terms of safe sport and how athletes have been treated by some of their coaches and all of those issues. But the real issue was to spend the money to develop the talent to try to actually do well internationally. And we equate that to what we think can happen if the government decides it wants to create Canadian programming internationally that has a chance of being seen globally, because we've now got the streaming services that allow us to do that, and tell Canadian stories, which there's nothing inherently less interesting about Canadian stories than Australian stories or anybody else's stories. But to do that, if government wants that to happen, government should fund it directly as it funded sports, and design a strategy that then supports the people who are producing those programs, and then builds a model that markets it to the streaming services, because the streaming services will take it. And as you may know, if you've seen any of the debate that's been going on, there's in fact a lot of stuff that's showing up on the streaming services at the moment that's actually shot in Canada and uses a lot of Canadian material, but isn't necessarily Canadian stories or that. So it's more saying if government thinks something should happen, government should fund it directly and set out some clear goals and mandates, and then the other side of it is then have the metrics that allow you to decide whether it's working or not, and you go with that way.
Yeah, you can never attain excellence if excellence is not indeed your goal.
That's right. And excellence clearly at the moment, I think excellence largely is not just Canadian stories for a Canadian audience, but it's Canadian stories for an international audience. Right. And because that's where a lot of the audiences are.
Right.
And the problem in part is that not many Canadians are seeing the Canadian stories that the CBC is putting on here.
As I said at lunch, I turned off the National the other night when the first story, the second story, and the third story were all American. Why am I watching this?
Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, part of the problem on that, I think, is that people in newsrooms spend all day sitting in newsrooms watching cable television. And what they see on cable television is stuff that's manufactured by cable television, but isn't necessarily reality or isn't necessarily the issues that are really important to people. But they're the issues that if you turn it around right, you can generate advertising revenue from by telling people, stay tuned for the next breaking news, and you may have seen CNN's new leadership has decided they're going to use breaking news a little bit less frequently. But that's all just an advertising ploy to get you to stick around to watch the ad, so you'll then come back after the ad. So if you spend all your time watching American cable channels, sitting in the newsroom, you think that what's on those channels is important, but it's not important to most people's lives, because most people don't watch cable television all day. They kind of have jobs and are busy.
Yeah.
And so what you still need is something at the end of the day that I think that, and CTV has successfully proven this, that provides a way of offering people who are interested a summation of what the important events are that they need to know. And where I think CBC has kind of lost its way, and I was thinking about that, the same point you made this morning when I turned on my radio on Friday morning, that would be the morning after the Ontario election, and the lead story on the 7 o'clock radio news was Joe Biden talking about gun control in the United States. Well, yeah. I'm sorry, we had an election in Ontario, which is the biggest province in the country, and it kind of should have been the top news item, even if you don't like Doug Ford. And I mean, they did win. It was an election and everything else. And I mean, on some level, who cares what happens to gun control in the United States? I mean, I don't mean that totally, but I do mean it on some level.
Yeah. And with this is my last question, and I'm going to turn it over to you, so get ready. And this goes back to the concept of excellence again. And one of the things that you talked about in the book, which I thought was terrific in identifying the solution, is we must have excellent, if you will, journalism. And you know a lot about exceptional journalism, being part of that world for so long and teaching it. And one of the things that you wrote is we must have exceptional journalism rather than going for clicks. So if you could explain what you mean by that, and how do we get to excellent journalism by ignoring going for clicks? And perhaps you could begin by talking about something that I had not heard about before. What is chart beat? And how does that kill excellence in journalism?
Chart beat, yes. Chart beat is something that's up in a lot of newsrooms, including CBC newsrooms, that shows you the number of people who are reading any given story at any point in time, the number of clicks to be on the story. And of course, the theory is that the more people who are reading the story, the more people are seeing the advertising on the story, and then the more people may click on the ads, and the news organization may reap more revenue from advertisers as a result of all that. So there's a big, and so this also gets into something called SEO, which does anybody know what SEO is? No. Yes, you do. What is it?
My brain's not fully functional, but I know what that is.
Which is?
I can't remember the...
Okay, search engine optimization, which is you design the headlines. You design the headlines in a way that will get people to actually click on the stories. And in some cases, it means, and so if we used to take it with my students, you'd get a copy of a newspaper, and I was teaching fourth-year journalism students, so I'd send them out to buy the Ottawa Citizen, and for many of them it was the first time they bought a newspaper, which was an interesting experience. But you get the route to look at the stories and in the paper, and then the stories that they have the same story that they have online, and the headlines are different. And what was the one I was thinking of? Yes, the one, and I'll give you an example. There was one great picture that we had, which was a picture of soccer, of the soccer goalie reaching out and making a fabulous save by making himself entirely horizontal, and the ball was just coming off of the end of his gloves. And the headline was from Russia. It was a Russian player, and the headline was from Russia with gloves, which of course is a takeoff on Ian Fleming and James Bond and all that sort of stuff. But you can't put that headline on a story online, because it will then all get clustered in with all the other stories about gloves. And so there's search engine optimization works on an interesting level, but the goal of some newsrooms, and increasingly in some cases the CBC, is to drive stories to the top and you do that by the type of stories you have. But those stories may not be the most important stories. They may not even be the most relevant stories, but they can be man bites dollars or some of those things. And as long as you're in an advertising world and you're competing for advertising dollars, they're going to do some of that. But what that means is when you're spending your time doing that, you're not spending your time thinking about other things and doing other stories you could do that could be more interesting. And the other thing you're not doing is not getting out of the newsroom enough and going to see things for yourself.
Right.
You won't have excellence if you're doing those sorts of stories. I mean, what you're looking for is something distinctive and pictures.
Right. So I watched the National. I didn't see anything about climate change, but I learned a lot about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard.
Which I would, I mean, sorry, but who cares?
Yeah.
Well,
sorry, Johnny.
Let me say two things. One, who cares? Which maybe is a little bit flippant, but honestly, it's not our legal system. These are the people who are being, whatever they're doing, whatever the decision is, has no impact on the similar issue that would happen in Canada. And the third thing that's equally important is that you can find that information in a zillion other places, so why do you actually need to find it there? It's almost as if the people who are running, not just the CBC, but other places too, are kind of still in a pre-internet world where they don't realize that there's some stuff they don't need to broadcast, because if you're really interested in it, you can find it anywhere else. So why do you have to do it? You should be thinking more about, I'd say that comes down to, there's two different issues that comes through. One of which is, I think, the lack of any sort of defining editorial philosophy at the moment as to what they think is important, and a program, and that plays itself out. But I'll just end with one little quick story from one of my students. And this was about, about 7 or 8 years ago now. And I used to teach a course for all the fourth year journalism students at Carleton, which is about 90 or 100 undergraduate students in fourth year. And that the course I taught was kind of a course on, this is the state of the media now, and a little bit about what you're going to see if you decide you're going to be a journalist when you graduate from the Bachelor of Journalism. Although traditionally about 25% of our students do go to journalism. So I taught the full year, and then I only taught half year, a couple of years, and I don't know, a friend, Lawrence Wall, who was a newsreader at CBC Ottawa. People get CBC Ottawa, you may have heard him. He taught the winter term, of course, and but his father died in Winnipeg, and he had to go to Winnipeg. Didn't have to, of course, he went to Winnipeg for the funeral and those things. So I ended up doing his first class of the term, and so what am I going to do? They're tired of me, but they've got me again for another week. There you go. So I asked them all, did anybody do any journalism or work in any newsrooms or do any apprenticeships or anything during the holidays? And several put up their hands, like at the Ottawa Citizen or some local Ottawa radio stations or CBC or some places in Ottawa, or even some went back home and did it at home over the holidays. And I said, well, what was the most surprising thing that you had experienced? And what they said was the most surprising thing was that nobody wanted to do anything except the same stories everyone else was doing, which kind of I thought was a pretty interesting comment. And I think we're past the point where we all should be doing the same stories, because if you're really interested in those issues, you can find them now anywhere else. So what you need to be thinking of is, what can you do that's different? What can you do that brings benefit to your audience, enlightens them one way or another, and can you do it better than anyone else? I'm sure that people will think that it's important that you go to them when something happens, that you want to know what's happening. So that's kind of how we design what we think the public broadcaster should do on television.
Yeah.
Which, as I said, I think to a significant degree, radio already does.
So, thank you very much, Christopher. I've truly enjoyed this conversation. I want to now, as promised, open it to you. If you would like to ask a question, put your hand up. I will recognize